Okay, everyone, it is May 13th, and it's time for the March edition of the Director's Cut. Once again, we have Tax Commissioner Ryan Rauschenberger on hand to discuss, as you may have heard, the Rauschenberger reverse, which we coined it, or the reverse tax trigger. So want to thank you all for coming. Make sure we have a lot of new people on the line. So just a reminder, let's keep it on topic and keep it to the contents mentioned in the Director's Cut, and we'll do our best to take your questions. So with that, we'll start as always with Mr. Helms with his comments and a little thoughts on the Director's Cut, and then we'll move into Commissioner Rauschenberger. So take it away, Lynn.
Well, I want to say thanks as well for everybody who turned out and tuned in. As usual, we take a little trip back in time. It is May, but we're talking about March production. And we usually try to assign a name to these things, and we were having a discussion yesterday. I like the name that was suggested. March was kind of a Picasso month. Lots of recognizable items in March, but they don't seem to really fit together. And so we've scratched our head a great deal about the month of March as to what all happened and why it happened. Several surprises. 1% increase in crude oil production. And we did not anticipate that. As you recall, we were expecting February, March, and April, maybe even May to be down months, with an up month in June as people worked on what they're now calling the frac log, or the backlog of unfracked wells. But contrary to that, we had a fourfold increase in well completions and a 1% increase in oil production, with a 3% increase in gas production. Surprises there. We think that is the small trigger, the effect of the small trigger to some extent. That and need for operators to maintain cash flow. And so several operators are operating under that paradigm, and that's a bad pun. But they're operating under the paradigm of maintaining production and cash flow through 2015, looking into 2016. It was good news that even with a 3% increase in gas production, industry held flat on gas capture. So gas capture remained good at 80% statewide, 81% in the Bakken, and some significant improvements on Fort Berthold in gas capture. We met with one of the major gas gathering companies or midstream companies that operates on Fort Berthold, and they're prepared for significantly more capture even than what is coming to the pipes at this point. They worked very hard to be ready for a lot of gas to come on in January, and they're only at about 60% of capacity. So they think they're well prepared for completion surges that we're anticipating in the last half of this year, and that's good news. So we think that at least through the middle of the year, we're in good condition as far as gas capture. Rig count, though, continued to drop, down 10% from April, and it just we think we're at or near the bottom. When I went through the 17 companies that we poll on a monthly basis, or even on a weekly basis sometimes, it looked like there was maybe only one more rig that was at risk, with us sitting at 83 today. Oil prices, of course, are one of the interesting topics, and want to touch a little bit on that. You saw that oil price is up significantly. North Dakota operators are saying that they will really get after that frac backlog in earnest at $65 WTI, and start to add rigs back in measurable quantities at $70. So when does that happen? I mean, there's a lot of speculation out there. The NYMEX strip shows us at $65 the last half of 2016. And the Saudi projections have us at $70 the fourth quarter of 2016. So we may be flat for a significant period of time here with 80 to 100 drilling rigs operating, and month on month, either not enough wells being completed to sustain production, or enough wells being completed to bring production back up to that 1.2 million barrels a day. So it looks like a pretty flat picture as we project out until this time next year. As you know, the gas capture rule is in effect. It has been since October 1, and the new goal took effect January 1. So we're exceeding that with another new goal coming up January 1 of 2016 of 85%. So we'll be evaluating that probably starting in the next couple of months to see how that goal is looking as far as industry getting there. And then oil conditioning took effect April 1. And I want to spend a little time talking numbers on oil conditioning. I had my oil measurement people talk to me about what they're seeing in terms of numbers. And it's a little bit overwhelming when you look at the number or the amount of data that they're processing. We have about 2,600 wells that will require or that are going to be done by vapor pressure testing on a quarterly basis. And so we've seen 2,552 of those. And we've got more than 99% compliance in that area. So we've only had 8 tests come in that were above the standard. They were given 48 hours to adjust their equipment and retest, and they all did that and passed the retest. On the other hand, we've got almost 9,800 wells that we're looking at treater temperatures and pressures. And we've gotten through 60% of those. We have the remainder of this quarter to get through the other 40%. We're finding about 90% compliance there. And I'll have better numbers for you as we work through a whole quarter of there. But on the ones that we've looked at to date, just under 5,800, 90% of them roughly have been in compliance, 10% haven't. And some of it's maintenance problems, some of it is human error, some of it's gas-locked treater. In other words, it's all natural gas going through it and no liquid, and so it's not maintaining production. What we're doing with those folks is giving them also 48 hours. So we'll either come back and recheck that equipment in 48 hours, or they've got 48 hours to run a vapor pressure test and recondition the oil and make sure that it's in compliance. What most of them have done in that situation is call the guys to come out and run a vapor pressure test. And that gives them another quarter then to work on their equipment and get it in shape so that they're in compliance the next time we come back to look at the equipment. So some pretty daunting numbers when you think about having to get through almost 13,000 wells and make sure that the vapor pressures or the equipment are in proper working order. But we have, I think, really good progress in that area. That is really all that I had to talk about. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to talk about oil prices and triggers of lots of varying kinds. And then we'll take questions.
Okay, well, first, thank you, Lynn. I'd also like to go slightly back in time a few months just to recap where we're at with the big trigger. Again, the big trigger takes 5 months, consecutive months, of being below the average of 55.09 of West Texas Intermediate crude at Cushing, Oklahoma. While January was an average of 47.98, February was $50.86, March was 47.76, April was 42.12. So very close to that 55.09. May to date, the average is 59.46. Based on our calculations, that would mean for the big trigger to become effective, for it to trigger on, again, this is the 5th month, consecutive month, using yesterday's closing of $60.75, the rest of May would have to be $52.25. So basically the posted WTI price would have to be $52.25 for May to be the 5th consecutive trigger month, meaning production starting January 1 would be triggered. That being the case, and we only really look at the next 2 weeks, we'll be watching very closely as far as what happens with the price. If prices do drop at $7, $8 now and hover around that $51, $52 for the rest of the month, we would trigger. If we're above that, the clock resets with the big trigger. And given the passage of House Bill 1476, there still actually is a chance for the big trigger to hit, but only for 1 month because the new law that was passed by the legislature gets rid of all of the big trigger incentives as of November 30th. So if all of a sudden you had prices drop for June, July, August, September, October, you could have 1 month with the big trigger still. But then after that, the big trigger goes away. It will be in House Bill 1476 that will be replaced starting January 1 with basically a flat 5% extraction tax rate as opposed to the current 6.5% rate fluctuating with prices based on this big trigger. The small trigger also, as was mentioned back in January, that will be allowed to sunset June 30th. That is still in place for all wells completed since February 1. So big trigger more than likely will not happen. If we do see a large drop in price, significant $7, $8 drop for the rest of this month, big trigger kicks in and would stay in place for at least 5 months. More than likely not going to happen. Lynn might have another opinion on that too, but I would just say that in the next 2 weeks, if we even drop just a few dollars, it will still trigger because we've been so high so far in May. The beginning of May was pretty strong with prices. That being said, going forward again, no more large trigger or small trigger starting January 1, 2016. The tax rate would be 5%, or for the extraction tax would be 5% on all production. Some specific drilling and well type incentives would be in place, but not the large trigger, which has the major fiscal impact for state revenues. Interestingly, the House Bill 1476 does put in a different trigger, which would be raising that new 5% oil extraction tax rate to 6% if oil exceeds $90 for 3 months. Same type of calculation, same type of daily close price that we have to look at and calculate a monthly average. But if that price ever exceeds 3 consecutive months above $90, we would then go from a 5% extraction tax rate to a 6% extraction tax rate. And it would trigger off the same way the big trigger would. If you're below $90 for 3 months, consecutive months, you would go back to the 5. So essentially, we're calling it the reverse trigger or the high price trigger. Reverse trigger was a term that was used while the legislation was being proposed. That being the case, our top rate in North Dakota still isn't 11.5%, it's 11%. But the vast majority of the time would imagine it would be at that top rate of 10% now, starting January 1, 2016. And with that, I guess I don't have any other specific issues to talk about, just that we'll be watching prices very closely for the next 2 weeks to see if we will trigger or not.
Yeah, and I think we did the calculation, Ryan, in December. We missed it by 13 days, basically. The first 13 days of December, the price was just a little high for that to be month 1 of the 5 months. So this may be one of those 13 or 14 day misses again, which in 2009 it was 1 day, one day that held off the big trigger. And I think one reason that we talked about the little trigger having some impacts is staff to staff. I'm hearing quite a bit of discussion about folks filing paperwork with the tax department with regards to the small trigger and exemptions under that. So we think that has had some impact and may be a part of the fourfold increase in completions that we saw as we went from February to March. Was that there's been a fair amount of paperwork come in over at your shop filing for the small trigger. So, and I would agree. And I know, I think Lynn has some March numbers, I believe, about how many wells were drilled. Right. Well, in March, we had 189 wells completed versus 42 in February. And I know the discussions happened between Allison and some of your oil tax staff. And I don't have the numbers. We'd have to get you those numbers in terms of the amount of paperwork or the number that people are filing for. But there was a definite uptick in paperwork filing for the small trigger exemption. So that's why we think it had some impact on increased completions in March, even though we had pretty weak oil prices in March.
Well, the legislature was planning on the large trigger kicking in, so that's why they set their budget. So now that likely will not, instead of a boost to the industry, it's really a boost to the state. How much of a boost?
Well, if you, oh, yeah, the question is in regards to really House Bill 1476 and budgeting. The legislature had assumed that the big trigger would kick in. The official forecast assumes that we would be triggered from June 1 production all the way through next May. If we do not trigger, it would be, holding production constant with the higher price. That would assume that we would actually collect, and I'm using a number that we've consistently used throughout this as additional, that rate difference between having basically an effective rate of 1% extraction tax if we trigger versus 11.1%. That's about $76 million a month. But of course, we have, if we're in the 60s, we have a price fairly well above the trigger price of 55.09, so it would be more than that $76 million. I don't have an exact number, but if you take that times the, just the next 6 months until the rate goes away, it's about $500 million. But that's holding the 1.1 million barrels per day fairly constant. That's the official number in our forecast, is a flat 1.1 million barrels per day. But that rate difference between being triggered or the current top rate of 11.5 is basically about $76 million a month. So that is, but that's at about a $45 North Dakota crude. So really, that's in that 55 to 60 range. So it's pretty close to that $76 million a month. And keep in mind, the extraction tax is all that's affected by the trigger, but that goes for the Water Resources Trust Fund for water, Common Schools Trust Fund, Foundation Aid, Legacy Fund, and also the general fund, but that's capped. So it mostly impacts those constitutional funds.
The same question has come in from multiple people. So you mentioned probably flat production. So does that mean you don't expect a surge in June? Or what are your thoughts on that? If the trigger doesn't hit, would there be a surge in June?
I still think we're going to have a sawtooth pattern in terms of production. And so we're going to have a series of down months followed by up months. March was a surprise. We still are looking at 800, I think roughly 885 wells that are drilled to TD. The casing, everything's installed. They're completely ready to frack, but they're not fracked. And there's still over 100 of those that have to be completed in June. So still looking for a production surge in June. So we could have flat production and have down months in April and May. And I think in this holding pattern that we're in through mid-2016, that's going to be the story, is 2 or 3 down months followed by an up month, with production basically staying in that bracket between 1.1 million and 1.2 million a day until we see the prices recover above the $65 number.
Oh, I had a question for Ryan. What's the status of the tax agreement with the 3 affiliated tribes?
Based on House Bill 1476, there will need to be a renegotiated agreement with 3 affiliated tribes based on their, we have not had the discussions post-session. At least we have not. We administer that. They actually have to agree and have the governor sign between the chair of 3 affiliated tribes, the chairman and the governor have to sign on to a new agreement based on 1476, and we would administer that. Indications from testimony and discussions with the chairman from 3 affiliated tribes is the bill that passed is more to their liking than the bill as it was introduced. So that is a good thing, a very good thing, given that a third of our production is within the boundaries. So I think it's promising. I think that we'll have to have those discussions going forward. Again, the changes in law don't occur until later this year. So there's definitely time to have those negotiations and have an agreement signed between the governor and the tribes.
Okay, on to keeping on well completions. Just thoughts on who's completing wells or who has the larger inventory?
Yes, I did take a look at that because with the added completions for the month, and part of the increase in well count was wells being returned to production. As you know, there's these old wells in the northern tier that sometimes are shut down in the middle of the winter, and then first opportunity they bring them back on. There were 51 of those, but the 189 completions, 4 companies basically had almost all of those. XTO, Hess, Continental, and Burlington. They appear to be more in tune with, having the normal capital flow, I guess you would say, cash flow, and continuing to complete their wells in a more aggressive manner than some of the other folks. Those who built inventory that really kind of stand out are EOG and Marathon. They both made statements that they're not sure if they'll complete any wells this year, that they're going to hold off on completions as long as they legally possibly can. So those are two companies that in the past we've always seen, pretty aggressive production growth and activity from those companies. But they're really holding firm on not completing wells. So the four big ones that were almost all the 189 or were all of the increase from 42 to 189 were Burlington, Continental, Hess, and XTO.
Okay, great follow-up question here about the companies that maybe aren't completing wells. Is there a risk to wellbore integrity with this backlog? So what do we do to monitor that?
We're not aware of any risk to wellbore integrity that comes from that, but we do check casing pressures on those wells when we visit those well sites on a quarterly basis. So that is one of the things that our field inspectors check, is to make sure that there isn't too much casing pressure. Most of the companies are installing 10,000 pound per square inch wellheads on these Bakken wells, and so they're plenty adequate. But we want to make sure there isn't some kind of a leak down hole, so we do require a pressure gauge be installed on that 7-inch casing, and we check the pressure.
Okay, if there's nothing on the completion lines, we have a question, of course, about oil conditioning. Could you elaborate a little more on why companies maybe were not able to properly condition, and if they're facing penalties? Yeah,
I'll start with the second half of the question. We have not contemplated any penalties for the roughly 11% or so at this point that have not been in compliance. They seem to be able to rework their equipment, and it looks like they're able to bring them into compliance. So they're getting a verbal notice of violation, and they've got roughly 48 hours to correct that. The number one thing that we're finding is what's called gas lock treaters. And now I get a little petroleum engineering here. Bakken wells typically flow for 6 to 9 months. And when they're doing that, lots of hot fluid is flowing through this equipment, and they don't have any problem maintaining temperature and pressure. Then they have to put the wells on pump. And for about the next 2 or 3 years, the wells really act crazy. I call them teenagers. They flump. They'll pump a little while, and then they'll flow like crazy, and they'll flow a lot of gas. And when they flow a big bubble of gas, it goes through the equipment, cools everything off, and gets everything out of compliance. And then at about 3 or 4 years, the wells settle down, and they really truly are pumping. And it's very easy to maintain equipment temperatures and pressures after the wells are 3 to 4 years old, and for the next 40 years. But there's that time period in there. Sort of like the teenage years when the wells really act up a lot, and we call it flumping, and it gas locks the equipment and cools it off. And in those cases, we think we're going to see quite a few of those 9,800 wells, maybe close to 1,000 of them, that will shift over to the vapor pressure testing, because they just can't keep the equipment in compliance, so that they know when an inspector shows up on any given day that that equipment's going to be in compliance.
Okay, I've gotten the same question a couple of different ways, so it's probably the only question I'll allow on this, just because it's getting a little out there. But everyone wants to know: do you think the oil conditioning rules helped with the train derailment or the accident in Heimdall?
We'll take a shot at that, and we do think it helped. I think if you compare the video and the photographs from Castleton to Heimdall, you see a different character to the derailment and the following fire. And also, to the best of our knowledge, and we've talked to the PHMSA folks and also to the owners of the rail cars and the owners of the oil, there were no events that are called BLEVs. That's another engineering term. It's called a boiling liquid explosive vapor event, a BLEVE. There were a lot of those in Castleton and none in Heimdall. So we think it had an impact. We're still waiting for information on the performance of the rail cars and the actual, how the rail cars were equipped. As you know, there are rules coming out on retrofitting rail cars and retiring rail cars and all of that. And we are very interested to know whether these newer rail cars had some of the equipment on it that we really strongly support in those rules. But we do think it made a difference. And we think what we've been able to do is remove those outlying Bakken crude oil situations where vapor pressure was well above average and resulted in, you know, Bakken crude oil that wasn't in the middle of the pack in terms of its volatility. So predictability, I think, is a big deal in terms of crude oil.
Ben, do you have a question?
I do.
Okay.
On Monday, the American Petroleum Institute petitioned U.S. court to block the requirement of the upgrading tank cars. I mean, with recent incident, why would they continue to not like this regulation?
Yeah, the question was API and their court case to get an injunction against the new rail car rules. And we've spent a little bit of time studying that. I think in many respects, North Dakota, the Industrial Commission, and API are pretty well aligned. API, in their comments on the rules, fully supported the relief valves. And we think that's probably the most important thing that can be done to rail cars, new or old, is these new relief valves. The estimate was it was only $1,500 per car to add those high flow closing, the new style of relief valves, and API supported that. Where they really disagreed with the new rules was these braking systems. They very strongly are opposed to the braking systems and strongly opposed to the timing of the phase out of the existing rail cars. They think it's far too aggressive, and that's the 2 points that they're making against the new rules. So we're somewhat aligned with them and not completely. And I'm not an expert on rail car braking systems or on how quickly the new rail cars can be built, but that's the real opposition they have, is the new braking systems and the phase out timing. We think the quicker that existing rail cars can be retrofitted, the better.
Okay. Sorry, I was really listening to your comments, so I didn't look at any of the questions. Okay, last question in terms of crude oil conditioning, because there has been some comments lately in the media, crude oil conditioning versus stabilization. You know, probably the biggest piece I would point to answer that question is we do have a frequently asked questions page on our website in relation to oil conditioning. So I highly recommend people to check out the issue versus crude oil conditioning and stabilization. So we'll probably leave it at that. Any other questions?
Well, I'd like to make one comment along those lines, and that is, yeah, it is my webinar. Yeah. Just a point that I, for one, continue to keep an open mind on this issue, on conditioning and whether it can achieve everything we want versus stabilization. And that's why we allowed for stabilization proposals within the order. And so just last week, I had an opportunity to meet with the general manager of the largest crude oil producer in the Eagle Ford. And I wanted to know, do you stabilize your crude oil? And the answer was absolutely no. I said, well, what about number 2 and number 3? You know, the other guys that you're working with down there in San Antonio. And he said, neither of them do either. So not that totally affirms what we're doing, but I want to emphasize that we do have an open mind on this issue, and we allowed for it in the order, and we will allow the science to direct where we go. So I'm always asking questions, and when I had a chance to have this is a shameless plug, when I had a chance to have a cup of caribou coffee with the general manager of the #1 producer in the Eagle Ford, that was a question I wanted answered. Do you stabilize your crude oil? And the answer was absolutely not, nor does #2 or #3. So I don't know how that got out there, but it just isn't a fact that that's what they're doing in the Eagle Ford. He is aware of condensate stabilization. There's a significant amount of that takes place because the Eagle Ford has a portion of the reservoir that is gas condensate.
Flaring question. So for so long, the tribal, the reservation was so much higher. Now that they're going gangbusters, is there something we can learn from the state side versus the reservation? What are they doing so well that maybe we can learn from them?
Great question. Since the Fort Berthold flaring numbers are better than the rest of the state, can we learn something from what's going on there? I think probably the biggest message I took away from meeting with the midstreamers on Fort Berthold was that they have a small number of producers on a relative basis. You realize that there's like 159 operating companies in North Dakota, and within the Fort Berthold reservation, there's only about 6 or 8. So they have a small number of producers, and they communicate with them weekly. I think that's the #1 thing that the rest of the state could learn is more focused communication between gas gatherers and processors and operators, more frequent, so that when operators are making their plans about which wells are going to complete where, that can be a dialogue. It was really an interesting conversation because the gentleman told me that one of his big operators had made plans to complete some wells in the northwest segment of Fort Berthold. And then they had seen some really good success with fracs down in the south central, and so they were going to make a quick shift, all their money down there, and complete a bunch of wells. And the gas gathering had been prepared for the northwest, not for the south central. So he begged or pleaded or discussed, and they shifted back again. So I really think gas capture really hinges on that communication, not so much through us as regulators. I think that's an important part of it, but gatherers and processors communicating very, very frequently with their operators. So they build the stuff where it belongs. And not only that, they can impact operators' plans.
I think it was gas capture, though. It's any idea how much production has been curtailed due to gas capture, either voluntary or mandated?
Ooh, I apologize. I don't have that number this month. Okay. I know we had an estimate for you last month.
Okay.
I didn't do that. We'll get a number. Yeah, we'll follow up.
Follow up on the Fort Berthold flaring. Do they have different penalties or enforcement for being in excess or being below gas capture targets than the state does?
The question was, does Fort Berthold have a different penalty structure? And I think I have to answer that yes, in that they are also subject to BLM penalties in terms of payment of royalties and the requirement to get approval from the BLM for flaring. So although I don't, as far as the state is concerned, we're treating them both the same. They do have the additional burden of getting approval from the BLM to flare, and they're also subject to penalties from the BLM if they flare without approval of the authorized officer. So I think there probably is a significantly hire penalty for flaring on Fort Berthold.
Can I ask one more question? One more, and then that's it. Could you just give an update? Crestwood, their pipeline on Fort Berthold, I've been reading they've had a number of spills recently. What's going on with that?
Right. And we're talking here, the question was about Crestwood and their pipeline system. And specifically, we're talking about the saltwater gathering system. That pipeline was installed in 2010. So our rules haven't allowed us to really get a lot of detailed information on that. And of course, we have the multi-jurisdictional issue, and the tribe wanted to take the lead on this. But there are substantial problems with that system, and it seems like with that product, at least the way that it was installed. And so we actually have the EERC folks out this week that are doing the pipeline research that's going to lead to the new rules the end of this year. And that is one of the top 10 topics is what about this construction material, and is it suitable for North Dakota? Is it an insulation problem or is it a material problem? And that's in the top 10 list for EERC to research.
Okay. All right. We will shift gears to Mr. Kringstad. So, hold on the line. Oh, yeah. No, nope, that's fine. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, perfect. Good morning, Justin Kringstad with the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. We'll just quickly walk through the set of material. So taking a look at production, one thing I do want to highlight, obviously the North Dakota numbers you heard from Lynn earlier. Montana, over the last several months, I have been seeing a downward trend in production. And so we'll keep that in the back of our mind when we start looking at some of the transportation numbers and some of the dynamics. I've not seen any type of major shifts on the South Dakota side of the border. So for 2015, again, you can see Montana in the low 60s, and then when we flip to 2014, they were trending in the mid 70s throughout much of 2014. And so that's something to continue to watch there. At this time, to my understanding, there are no drilling rigs in Montana. So again, our transportation network shared between all three of these states. And so what happens in each of them does have an impact on the overall dynamics. So for March, my estimates for how the crude oil was being moved, again, just minor shifts from February to March. We saw, again, just a slight shift in more crude being transported by pipeline. And so we saw a 1% shift or decrease on the rail side and an increase on the pipeline side. When we take a look at the overall percentage trends, we have been seeing a decreasing trend in the percentage of crude oil being moved by rail and an increasing trend in the amount of crude oil being moved by pipeline. A couple of the dynamics at work there. Early this year, we did see a large pipeline system go into service. That was the Double H system. So that did have an impact on some of these early numbers with barrels heading down towards Guernsey, Wyoming. Along with that, we'll also see a startup here very shortly in the numbers of the Dakota Prairie refinery. And so there's some things behind the scenes with those systems that are going to continue to alter these numbers as we go forward. The overall rail volumes that I estimated were down again here in March. And so we're hovering somewhere around that 700,000 barrels per day estimated. And so again, the impacts there, you have the Double H pipeline system going into service. You have the, you'll see on the next slide, slide 7, we've seen a significant decrease in the amount of truck traffic coming into North Dakota from Canada. It's real tough. I don't have a real good sense of what's happening on the Canadian side with different transportation dynamics, but my understanding or my guess is going to be that barrels that were coming to use North Dakota rail terminals are accessing rail facilities that are now operational on the Canadian side of the border. And so we'll see if this is a long-term trend where we see that continued decrease in the amount of truck traffic coming across into the U.S. network. On the pricing side, again, as of this morning, not a real big shift on the spread, the Brent WTI, so I don't anticipate the current market prices making any dramatic shifts one way or the other, pipe versus rail. And so that's going to continue to work itself out with different commitments. And as, again, we see these systems come online. On the flaring side, again, no big change on the dynamics of why gas is being flared statewide. again, majority of that gas being flared from wells that are connected to the systems. And so the two sets of efforts going on in the field, first to get the wells connected, and then also continuing to expand and develop and enhance the existing pipeline system so that both pieces of that flaring puzzle can be addressed. And then on the 5%, this is one of the easier metrics to try and watch how fast the wells are getting connected to the gas gathering systems. And again, we saw in March some good news with more gas connections and wells that were brought onto service or in service. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Come on, people, he's here. Give it a couple seconds, let him type, hit send.
Well, this might be putting you on the spot, but in terms of that 1% shift that you said between crude and the rail and pipeline, is there a way to put that in barrels at all, or any kind of estimates like that in terms of how much that 1% shift equals in terms of volume?
So the question was trying to get some numbers behind some of those rail shifts. And so I do have these. The hard numbers are on my website that make up this chart, the estimates. Just looking at it off the top of my head, it's going to be in the tens of thousands. Again, I'd have to take a look at the hard numbers, but that is on my website. If you want to see what the percent or hard number estimate changes were month to month, that's all online.
I have a question, Justin. How much does the price of oil affect the decision to ship by rail versus by pipeline, if at all?
So the question was, how much does the price of oil and the market dynamics impact the decision to ship by pipe or by rail? It has a major impact. That is one of the significant driving forces. So again, if you're a barrel of oil, the first thing is you have to see if you're committed to one system or another. You may have existing commitments on a pipeline system, such as we would see when a new pipeline starts up. Obviously, that pipeline had commitments backing its construction. So when a new system starts up, with the expectations that we'll see barrels moved on that system. If you're a barrel that's not committed to pipe or not committed to rail, and you have that market flexibility to make that decision, then yes, you'll look at what options are available, what are the price conditions on the different refining centers, and then just make that business decision of how you're going to move that barrel to the various destinations.
But is one cheaper than the other?
No, you're going to have, the question was the price difference. So every destination is going to have a different price point, how much it's going to cost you to get there either by pipe or by rail. And so they'll take that transportation cost into the overall consideration, right? So if say that the East Coast, we know that rail is more expensive than pipe, but if there's a price advantage on the East Coast at a given period of time, you may spend the extra money to move by rail car versus the pipeline cost and the pipeline market price. So, yeah.
Any updates on Dakota Access pipeline approval in other states?
No. At this point, the Dakota Access is working its way through the various state regulatory programs, and so each of those states will be responsible for determining the placement of that pipeline system in the state. And so right now that's still ongoing and really at the early stage of that process.
Any updates on pipelines that are maybe set to open in the next few months for oil or gas? So any states that are looking to come online soon?
At this point, the major pipeline systems are still out longer term than in the next few months. So you've got Sandpiper, Dakota Access, the Upland Pipeline. Those are all 2017 and beyond as far as the timelines go. And so for any major new crude oil systems, the only thing that we've seen here recently, obviously Double H and then the Dakota Prairie Refinery. But after that, there's going to be a lag before we see some additional systems get put into place. And then on the gas systems, those for major interstate natural gas pipelines, no, there's nothing in the immediate future. And then we will see some additional gas processing facilities be brought into service here over the next several years.
Was there a decline in volume of oil going to the Tesoro refinery, or just a percent decrease?
I think it was just a percent. That refinery typically is just running at its normal nameplate capacity. I didn't anticipate or see any shift or reason to alter those. I think the percentage keeps going down as North Dakota's production continues to go up, so that nameplate capacity, that refinery, becomes less and less of a percent as going forward.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. So with that, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you.